Nobody in the neighbourhood understood why a black car worth more than most of their mortgages was parked on the corner of Dunbar and 5th that Thursday morning. The driver stayed behind the wheel. The man in the back seat stayed very still, watching through tinted glass as a woman in a yellow apron taped a handwritten sign to a plate glass window. The sign said, in careful block letters, that the store was back open. That it was, after 14 months, finally back. He did not get out. Not yet. He just watched her, the way people sometimes watch something they thought they had lost and then found again in the last place they expected. His name was Marcus Dean, and 48 hours earlier he had been booked on a flight to Dubai. A 3-day summit, 4 meetings with international partners, the kind of trip that took 3 weeks to schedule and that 15 other people had built their own calendars around. He had cancelled it the morning before with nothing more than a text to his assistant Priya that said to reschedule and that she could tell the overseas partners he had a personal matter. She had sent 3 follow-up messages before she stopped asking why. He had not answered any of them. Loretta Sims was 39 years old and she had been running the store on the corner of Dunbar and 5th for 9 of those years. It had been her mother's store before that, and her mother's before that, which meant the building had more family history in its walls than most people could name in their own bloodlines. The original sign was still up above the door, painted in faded green and white. Sims Family Goods. Her grandmother had chosen those words deliberately. Not a shop, not a market. Goods, as in something worth having, something given with intention. Loretta had grown up behind the counter. She had done homework on it, stacking textbooks between the register and the display of canned goods when she was in middle school, doing long division on a notepad while her mother rang up customers and made change without ever looking at the drawer. She had learned to count change before she learned to read cursive. She knew every customer's name, knew which ones were on fixed incomes and needed the extra few days to settle up, knew which kids came in after school because they were hungry in a way that had nothing to do with wanting a bag of chips. She knew, without being told, the difference between someone buying one item to make the rent stretch to Friday and someone buying one item to feel normal for 5 minutes. She treated both the same. Her mother, Doris, had run the store for 22 years before her knees made it impossible. The knees had been a slow negotiation, first a brace, then a cane, then finally the acknowledgement that 10 hours a day on a concrete floor was not something a 67-year-old body could keep negotiating with. Doris had passed the store to Loretta the way you pass something sacred, with both hands and a warning. "The neighborhood is changing, baby," she had said. "You hold your ground." Loretta had tried to hold it. If you're the kind of person who has ever held something under pressure and wondered if the holding was worth it, stay with this story, because what happened on that corner on a Thursday morning is going to stay with you. For the first 7 years, the store did what it had always done. It fed people. Not elegantly, not with organic produce arranged in baskets or artisan bread on wooden boards, but with $2 cans of soup and off-brand cereal in bulk bags, and the kind of hot sauce that only existed in neighborhoods that had been figuring out how to make a dollar sink for generations. Loretta stocked what her customers needed, not what photographed well. She extended credit when she could. She remembered birthdays. She kept a jar of hard candy on the counter that was specifically for children, stocked from her own pocket, so that no child who came into the store ever left empty-handed if they came in with nothing. The margin on almost everything was thin enough to see through, but the store was alive, and Loretta was alive in it, and that had been enough. Then the summer 2 years ago happened. A water main broke 2 blocks over in June, and the flooding reached the back of the store by the second day. It ruined the stockroom, took out the walk-in refrigerator, warped the floorboards in a 30-foot run along the back wall, and turned 3 weeks of perishable inventory into a pile of damaged goods she could not sell and could not recover in full through her insurance policy, which had a flooding exclusion she had not read carefully enough when she signed it 6 years earlier. She lost $9,000 in merchandise in 4 days. She borrowed against the store to pay for repairs, then spent the rest of the summer watching the foot traffic thin because the block smelled like mildew even after the drying and the bleach and the fans, and people who had started going to the new grocery store 2 avenues over during the closure found they liked the wider aisles and kept going there. She almost closed then. She did not. She patched what she could patch, cleared the smell with industrial cleaners she mixed herself from supplies she looked up online, stripped and replaced the warped floorboards with help from her cousin Darnell, who was a carpenter and who worked 2 weekends in a row for nothing except lunch. She stayed open through the heat of August, with a box fan pointed at the register and a sign on the door that said, simply, "Still here." The loan was real now, and the winter was slow, and by January of the following year, the numbers no longer worked in any combination Loretta could arrange. She sat with spreadsheets at her kitchen table for 3 weeks running, adjusting figures, looking for a version of the math that came out different. It never did. Her landlord, a property management company whose representative she had never met in person and whose principal she could not name, sent a notice in February. Rent was increasing by 40% at the start of the new lease term, which was 90 days away. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It was signed with initials. It did not include a name she could call. It did not include a reason. It did not include the word sorry. She took the notice home and sat with it at her kitchen table for a long time that evening. Her daughter Camille was doing math homework at the other end of the table in the same chair where Loretta had done her homework as a girl, in this same apartment above a cousin's apartment, 2 floors above the street. Camille was 12, the age where children still pretend not to be watching their parents, while watching their parents constantly. Loretta folded the letter and put it face down without saying anything. She said, "How's the homework going?" And Camille said, "Fine." And neither of them named the thing that was sitting between them on the table. Loretta applied for 2 small business loans over the next 6 weeks. One was denied because her revenue numbers over the prior 12 months had dropped below the qualifying threshold after the flooding losses. One was denied because the flooding damage had affected her credit profile in ways the loan officer explained clearly and apologetically, and that Loretta understood perfectly well and that did not change the outcome. She applied for a grant through the city's Small Business Recovery Fund and was told she was on a waiting list that currently had 212 names on it. She tried to negotiate with the management company. She sent a formal letter via certified mail requesting a conversation about the rent increase. She followed up with an email. She called the phone number on the management company's letterhead and reached a voicemail that gave her another number, which she called and reached another voicemail, which directed her back to the email address she had already used. She was patient with this process because she understood that patience was not optional. She was not obstinate or naive. She was doing every single thing that a person can do when the system has arranged itself, not out of malice, but out of indifference, which is often worse than malice because there is nothing to argue with. She kept the store open as long as she could. In March, she made the hardest decision of her adult life. She closed. She turned off the lights, locked the register, put the jar of candy in a bag to take home so it wouldn't go stale, and taped a sign in the window that said, "Thank you. We'll be back." She could not be certain she believed the second sentence when she wrote it, but she wrote it anyway because some things you say before you are certain of them, because the saying is part of how you get there. She did not cry inside the store. She waited until she was home, until Camille was in her room with the door closed, and then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of it. She had made every decision correctly. She had not been reckless or naive. She had worked the way her mother taught her to work, steadily and with care, and the math had still come out wrong, and there was nothing to argue with because there was nothing on the other side of the math that had a name or a face or a phone number that returned calls. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to bed. The 14 months that followed were not simple, and Loretta did not make them look simple. She picked up part-time work at a pharmacy 3 neighbourhoods over, stocking shelves in the back, which meant she was doing, in someone else's fluorescent-lit building, a version of exactly what she had done in her own, except without the faces she knew, without the names she had memorised over 9 years, without the jar of candy on the counter and the grandmother's sign above the door. The pharmacist whose shelves she stocked was not unkind, but he did not know her name for the first 3 weeks, and by the time he learned it, she had already understood what it felt like to be the kind of person who could disappear into a building and never be missed. She noted it. She did not become it. She paid what she could on the business loan and let a few of the smaller personal bills run late and told Camille only as much as a 12-year-old needed to know, which was enough that Camille started turning off lights in rooms she left and stopped asking for things she used to ask for, and once, on a Saturday morning, made breakfast for both of them without being asked and set a plate in front of Loretta without saying anything about it. A full plate. Eggs and toast, and the orange juice she had cut in half with water without being told, because she was her mother's daughter, and she had learned to read a situation without being given a briefing. Loretta looked at that plate for a moment before she said, "Thank you." Camille shrugged like it was nothing. It was not nothing. Loretta knew that, and someday Camille would know she knew. She looked at the corner store every time she passed it on the bus home from the pharmacy. It was a 20-minute ride, and the route went down 5th, and she could see the security gate from the window on the right side of the bus. The gate she had bought in the second year of running the store, because the old one had rusted through and now it hung over the dark window like a curtain that refused to open. Someone had stuffed flyers in the door handle. Someone else had spray-painted something on the gate. Nothing hateful, just a tag, a name or a symbol. But Loretta had gone on a Saturday and scrubbed it herself with a wire brush and some cleaner, alone on the sidewalk in the early morning before anyone was up, because the store was still her responsibility, even when it was closed. The windows filmed over with dust. The faded green and white signs stayed above the door. Sims Family Goods. Still there. 9 months into the closure, Loretta got a phone call from the city grant program. Her name had come up on the list. The grant was $12,000, which was not enough to reopen on its own, but was enough to have a serious conversation with a bank. And a serious conversation with a bank was what she had been unable to have for the better part of a year. She went to her community credit union, a small institution 2 avenues over that had been in the neighbourhood longer than most of its current customers had been alive, and sat across a desk from a loan officer named Mr. Tran, who had reviewed her file carefully and had some questions, and then had some more questions, and then, at the end of an hour, said that he thought they could work with her. The terms were not comfortable. They were survivable. There is a difference between those two things, and Loretta understood the difference better than almost anyone, and she said, yes. She spent the next 2 months planning what the reopening would look like. She negotiated with the management company through a tenant advocacy organisation that agreed to take her case pro bono, a woman named Carmen, who had been doing this work for 12 years and who was not impressed by property management companies with initials for signatures. Carmen got the increase reduced from 40% to 18%. 18% was still real money. It was money Loretta could plan around if she was careful, and she was always careful. She sourced suppliers again. She rebuilt the inventory list from scratch, keeping what had always moved and reconsidering what hadn't. She planned to reopen on a Thursday morning, early, the same day of the week the store had first opened when her grandmother started it. A Thursday in April, 41 years before Loretta was born. She painted the storefront herself 2 Saturdays before the reopening, with Camille on one side holding the tape, and her mother Doris in a folding chair on the sidewalk, wrapped in a coat, even though the April morning was almost warm. The paint was the same green and white as the original sign. Loretta had matched it from a photograph. "You sure about those colours?" Doris asked, in the tone of a woman who already knew the answer and was asking to make Loretta say it out loud. Loretta stood back from the window and looked at the fresh paint, the crisp green and white against the brick. "Same as always, Mama," she said. Doris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." She said it in a way that closed the conversation, the way she had always ended conversations that had said everything they needed to say. On the morning of the reopening, Loretta arrived at the store at 5:30. The block was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that belongs to places between their last night and their first morning. She unlocked the door, disengaged the security gate for the last time, and folded it back against the wall and stood for a moment in the doorway before she flipped on the lights. The overhead fluorescents buzzed once and steadied, and the store came back into visibility the way a face comes back when your eyes adjust in a dark room. The shelves she had been restocking over 3 days of prep work stood straight and full. The counter was clean. The register was ready. She placed the jar of candy exactly where it had always stood, left of centre, so that a child coming through the door would see it before they had fully stepped inside. She arranged the shelves methodically, the way her mother had taught her, densest items at eye level, the things people reached for automatically in one place, and the things they needed to be reminded of in another. She checked the refrigerated case. She checked the register a second time. She stood in the middle of the floor for a few minutes in the quiet before daylight, the low hum of the overhead lights filling the room, and looked at everything she had put back together. 14 months. The math of it was simple, the weight of it was not. She had posted the reopening date once on the neighbourhood social board. The post had gotten 7 responses, which was not many. She had decided that was fine. The store would open, and the people who needed it would find their way back, the same way water finds the places that are ready for it. She was not looking for ceremony. She had never needed ceremony. She was, in fact, alone on the sidewalk with the poster board sign and a roll of tape when the black car came around the corner and stopped. Marcus Dean had built his company over 26 years, from a 12-person logistics startup running out of a rented office in a business park to one of the 15 largest regional supply chain operators in the country. He employed 900 people across 6 locations. He sat on 2 non-profit boards, gave a lecture once a year at a business school across the river, and maintained a schedule that his assistant Priya described to new colleagues as a masterpiece of compression. There were weeks in which every hour from 7 in the morning until 10 at night was accounted for by someone other than himself. He was 53 years old, and he had not, in 6 years of working together, cancelled an international trip for a personal reason. Priya had, quietly, checked with his doctor's office when the first follow-up went unanswered. She did not mention this to Marcus. She had mentioned it to exactly no one. He had grown up 4 blocks from the corner of Dunbar and 5th, in the 3rd-floor apartment of a building that had since been converted to condominiums that his childhood self could not have imagined affording. His mother, Vera, had worked 2 jobs through most of his adolescence, a morning shift at a laundry and an evening shift at a care facility, which meant there were hours between shifts when Marcus was responsible for the household in the ways a 14-year-old can be responsible. He cooked what he could cook. He did the shopping when the list was short enough and the errand was close enough. He ran to Sim's Family Goods on evenings when his mother was too tired to go herself, carrying the handwritten list she left on the counter, carrying whatever cash she could spare in an envelope with his name written on the outside. The woman behind the counter in those years was Doris Sims, who was perhaps 40, perhaps 45, who wore her hair natural in a way that Marcus thought of as serious and kind at the same time, who knew his mother's name and always found a way to round down on the total when it mattered, quietly, without announcement, without looking up from the register in a way that would require acknowledgement. He had understood, even at 14, what she was doing and why she was doing it without comment, and it had lodged in him the way certain observations lodge in children, not as a lesson, but as a fact about what decency looks like in practice. He had left the neighbourhood at 22 when the startup he had co-founded with 2 classmates began to be serious enough to require his full attention and a place closer to the warehouses they were servicing. He had visited his mother on holidays and birthdays and had driven her to appointments and eventually helped her move into a better apartment when his income allowed it. He had not come back to the block much. That was a fact he carried with him in the way you carry a fact you cannot do anything about but have not yet made peace with. 14 months ago, while reviewing his phone late on a Sunday evening, he had been scrolling through a neighbourhood newsletter he had been added to years before by someone he no longer remembered, and he had seen the brief notice about the store on the corner of Dunbar and 5th closing. 2 sentences. A photograph of the sign in the window. He had put the phone down and sat with it. He thought about Doris and the way she rounded the total down without making it a thing. He thought about his mother's handwriting on the list. He thought about being 16 and coming up short on the change for a bottle of aspirin his mother needed, and Doris saying simply, low, just between them, "Take it, pay me next time." And he had, the following week. He had remembered to do that. He had been proud of himself for remembering, and now, 37 years later, he still remembered it. He reached out through the newsletter's contact form, which was not something he did as a rule, and asked whether there was a way to contribute to the store directly. Bernice, who had been running the neighbourhood board for 11 years, wrote back and said the owner was not, as far as she knew, accepting personal donations, but that there was a city recovery fund for small businesses affected by the flooding. He had contributed to that fund. Substantially. He had done it under the name of the foundation he ran, a small family foundation that operated without publicity, because he was not interested in credit and because his mother had raised him to understand that help offered for the sake of being seen was something different from help. He did not know when he contributed where the money would go. That was the nature of a general fund. It pooled and dispersed. 7 months later, his foundation administrator, a careful woman named Sylvia, who reviewed all the fund's activity quarterly, flagged something in the disbursement records during a routine review. One of the grants from the Small Business Recovery Fund had gone to a business on the corner of Dunbar and 5th, a store called Sim's Family Goods. Sylvia had set the file on his desk with a post-it note that said, "Thought you'd want to see this." He read the file. He read the address twice. He asked Sylvia to find out when the reopening was planned for. She came back 20 minutes later and said the store was reopening in 3 days. He looked at his calendar. He looked at the flight details for Dubai. He looked back at his calendar. He called Priya and told her to reschedule the trip. She asked if he could give her a reason to communicate to the overseas team. "Personal," he said. tell them personal. He did not plan what he would do on Thursday morning. He had not called ahead, had not told anyone he was coming, had not thought through what he would say when he arrived. He understood that some things could not be planned in the way that meetings could be planned, and that trying to script them diminished them. He told his driver to take him to Dunbar and Fifth for 7 in the morning. He arrived to find a woman in a yellow apron standing alone on the sidewalk, pressing a handwritten sign against the glass with careful hands, smoothing the edges down as if she were handling something that could tear. He sat in the car and watched her for a few minutes. He was not sure how long exactly. Long enough to see the deliberateness in everything she did, the way each motion was considered, unhurried, the way she stepped back once to check the sign's alignment and then stepped in again to press one corner more firmly against the glass. He thought about his mother's handwriting on the list. He got out of the car. Loretta heard the door and turned around. She saw a man in a well-made coat somewhere in his 50s, walking toward her with the unhurried pace of someone who had decided something and was not going to change his mind. She straightened and waited. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "We don't open for another 2 hours if you're looking to shop." He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the sign she had just put up, then at the old painted letters above the door. He looked at them for a moment longer than was casual. Then he looked at her. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to shop." He paused. "I grew up 4 blocks from here." She watched him. "My mother used to send me to this store when I was a teenager. Your mother was behind the counter then." He paused again, and there was something in the pause that was not performance. "I just wanted to see it open again." Loretta studied his face. There was something in the way he had said it that did not sound like small talk. It sounded like something he had been carrying for a while and had decided to set down. She said, "What's your name?" "Marcus," he said. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something has confirmed itself, rather than surprised you. Then she said that her mother's name was Doris. "She's going to be here at 9 o'clock. I think she'd like to meet you again." He said he would stay. They did not have a long conversation in those 2 hours before Doris arrived. They were not that kind of strangers, and the morning was not that kind of morning. It called for presence rather than conversation, and both of them seemed to understand that without discussing it. He asked once if he could help with anything, and she handed him the roll of tape while she cut pieces off, and for a while the two of them worked in the early morning light, quiet and purposeful, setting up the store the way it needed to be set up, without fuss. 3 customers came before 9. Roy was first, a man Loretta recognized immediately, 63 years old with a voice like a church pew, who had lived 2 buildings down for 31 years and who shook Loretta's hand for a long time before he said anything. He bought a bag of ground coffee and a tin of crackers. He told Loretta her mother would be proud. He said it directly, looking at her, not as a pleasantry, but as an observation. Loretta thanked him. The second and third customers were younger, a woman with a toddler who bought milk and orange juice and who said without prompting that she had missed this place. She said it to no one in particular and to everyone in the room. Marcus stood near the window and said nothing. He was not in the way. He was simply present, which was what he had come to be. At 9:15, a car stopped outside, and Doris emerged with the careful deliberateness of a woman for whom every step required its own small conversation with a body that had worked hard for a long time. She had dressed up. She wore a good blouse the colour of cream and a wool hat with a brim, the kind of hat she wore to occasions she considered worthy of a hat, which were not many. Camille was behind her, one hand lightly on her grandmother's arm, guiding without crowding. Doris came through the door and stood just inside it for a moment, not moving. She looked at the shelves, at the counter, at the jar of candy, at the light coming in clean through the windows Loretta had washed the day before. Her hands were still at her sides. Then she saw Marcus standing near the window. She looked at him the way someone looks at a face they have filed away in a place they did not expect to open again. Her expression went through several things quickly. Recognition, then a kind of accounting, then something that was very close to joy, but quieter than joy. "You're not," she said. He smiled. "I am." He said his mother's name, just the first name, the way you say a name when you are trusting the other person to place it. Doris put one hand flat against her chest. She was still for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that had settled into something below its normal register, that she remembered him, that he had always been very polite. He said, "You were always very kind." They looked at each other for a moment. Two people who shared a small piece of history that had turned out to matter more than either of them had known at the time. Loretta had not moved. She was watching her mother's face, and the expression on her own face had shifted over the preceding few seconds, from curiosity to something that was not quite understanding yet, but was very close to it. Marcus told them then, standing near the window in the morning light with Roy by the coffee aisle and Camille watching from beside her grandmother. He told them without making a speech of it, without arranging it into something more than it was. He said he had seen the notice about the closure 14 months ago in a neighbourhood newsletter, and that it had stayed with him in a way he hadn't expected, and that he had contributed to a city recovery fund not knowing where the money would go. He said his foundation administrator had found the disbursement record recently, had found the address on the grant, and had brought it to him. He said he was not there to claim credit for anything, that the grant had come from a public fund to which many people had given, and that his contribution was one piece of a larger thing. He said he was there because some moments deserve a witness, and he had not been back to this neighbourhood enough in the years since he left, and he wanted to say that plainly. He paused. He looked at Doris. "Your mother was kind to my family during years when kindness cost something," he said. "I don't think I ever said that out loud to her face. I'm saying it now." Doris was quiet for a long moment. She looked at him the way someone looks when they are absorbing the fact that the world has produced this particular morning, in this particular store, after the particular 14 months they have all just lived through. She seemed to be deciding whether to trust it. Then she said, "Come here," and held out both arms. He crossed the room and she held him briefly, firmly, the way a woman holds someone she has decided to receive. And then she stepped back and looked at him and said, "Your mother was a good woman. I remember. She always paid." He laughed, a short, genuine sound, and said, "She made sure of it." Camille, who had been watching all of this with the focused attention of a 12-year-old who understood she was seeing something she would remember, leaned slightly toward her grandmother without saying anything. Doris reached back and patted her hand. The store filled steadily after that. By 10 o'clock there were 7 customers, which was not a crowd but was more than Loretta had let herself expect, and Roy had bought a second tin of crackers because he said he had been planning on them for 14 months and one tin was not going to cover what he was owed. Loretta told him to take it and pay her Thursday, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "You sound like your mother." And she said, "That is the best thing you could have said to me today." Marcus left before 11. He said goodbye to Doris first, then to Camille, who gave him a nod that was the equivalent, in the language of 12-year-olds, of a full conversation. He said goodbye to Loretta at the door. She said, "Thank you for staying." He said, "Thank you for reopening." There was a pause. She looked at the sign in the window, the one she had taped up that morning in the early quiet before anyone arrived. He looked at it too. He said her grandmother had picked a good name for this place. She said, "She picked it on purpose." He nodded. That was clear, he said. In the weeks that followed, Marcus arranged for Loretta to speak with a commercial real estate attorney who specialized in small business lease negotiations. He made the introduction through his assistant, low-key, without ceremony. The attorney was a woman named Diane who had been practicing for 18 years and who spent a morning reviewing Loretta's lease before identifying 2 provisions the property management company had not enforced, and 3 that, under new city guidance, were potentially challengeable. She did not resolve everything. She resolved enough. Marcus did not tell anyone about any of this. He did not take a photograph, did not make a post, did not share the story with anyone in his professional orbit. He had grown up watching his mother make decisions about what was worth telling people and what was worth simply doing, and he had internalized the distinction early. He had not uncrossed it since. The store stayed open. No ribbon was cut, no photograph taken for anyone's account. It is still open now on the corner of Dunbar and 5th under the faded green and white letters that Loretta's grandmother painted there 41 years before Loretta was born. The sign Loretta taped to the window on the morning of the reopening is gone now, replaced by a proper printed banner. But if you look closely at the bottom left corner of the window glass, you can still see a faint outline from the tape. A small rectangle where the corners were pressed down carefully, as if the thing being hung were fragile. Doris comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays when her knees will allow. She sits in the good folding chair with the cushion that Loretta set up behind the counter specifically for her, and she talks to customers the way she has always talked to them, by name, with attention, the way her own mother taught her in this same room decades ago. She does not miss much. Camille comes in on Saturdays. She restocks the shelves and counts the change and learns the arithmetic of a place that has always been about more than arithmetic. She is 13 now. She has started, without being asked, to remember the names of the customers who come in regularly. The jar of candy on the counter is always full. Roy still comes in for his coffee and crackers every few days without fail. He told Loretta once, several months after the reopening, sitting on the stool she keeps on the customer side of the counter for people who need a moment to rest their feet, that he had started coming to this store as a young man because it was the closest one to his apartment. He said he had kept coming for 31 years because it was the only place on this block where he felt certain that somebody knew his name. He said it plainly, without sentiment, as a fact. Loretta said, "We know your name, Roy." He said, "I know you do." Marcus drove past the corner twice in the months following the reopening, on separate occasions, heading to meetings in that part of the city. The second time he asked his driver to slow down without explaining why. The driver slowed without asking. The store's window was lit from inside. The green and white sign above the door caught the streetlight and held it. There were shapes moving in the warm glow behind the glass. He did not get out. He had already done what he came to do. He sat with the lit window for a moment, the warm yellow square of it against the dark of the street and the quiet of the early evening. And he thought about his mother and the list she used to write. The way each item was printed clearly, deliberately, in her handwriting that never changed over the years. The way she always included exactly what she needed and nothing she did not. The way she would hand him the envelope with the cash and tell him to bring back the change because the change was always counted. He thought about standing at that counter at 14 with his mother's list, and Doris behind the register, and the particular quality of being somewhere that knew your name and would not make you feel the weight of needing to be there. Some things you cannot plan. Some things you can only show up for and hold the tape when someone hands it to you and say what needs saying when the moment calls for it. He had done that. It had not been complicated. The rest, it turned out, had taken care of itself. Have you ever walked past a place that held your family's history? A counter your grandmother stood behind, a corner where someone was kind to your parents before you were old enough to understand what kindness cost? Leave a word in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, there are more on this channel about the people who hold things together quietly for years before anyone thinks to say thank you. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the lived experiences of real communities. All names, characters, businesses, and events depicted are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons or places is coincidental.